Hello, Dr. Stillman. Um, my name is Inska and I'm a Danish citizen. I'm half Belgian actually, so I have double citizenship. And I found an interview with you on YouTube and I was very impressed by how well spoken you are. And so I decided to contact you. And this is why we are having this interview. And the reason is that I'm not a medical expert, right? So I'm just a mother and a student. I study literature in the university. Mm-hmm. And I had no idea what was going on. I was sort of just listening to what my government was saying until in the start of November, I read a law that was being discussed and nearly was passed. It's called the epidemic law. And when I read this law proposal, I nearly fainted. And I could just simply see how they were trying to install a fascist system and just like throw all democratic and civil rights aside because of this virus that I started researching and then found out that there wasn't really any big problem with this virus. And that's just how I started researching and that's how I found you. So now I would like you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Leland Stillman and I am a physician in the United States. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia on the East Coast. And I trained first in Virginia at University of Virginia, and then I went to Maine Medical Center in the Northeast part of the country to finish my training in internal medicine. And after that, I spent 3 years traveling all over the country to different hospitals. And the last year, I've worked in 2 different states and seen a lot of patients, been working really full time. And so, I showed up at a protest because our governor here our governor's appointed health director of the state said that he was thinking about mandating vaccination for the public. And I obviously support prudent public health measures and I want people to be healthy and safe, but I also don't think it's appropriate for the government to force people to take a medication or a medical treatment for any reason based on our Constitution. And then that interview went viral and apparently got all the way to Denmark.
Yes, it was a very good interview. Yeah. And you are, of course, not the only medical doctor who is saying this.
No, there are many, many more. And there are far more who contact me who are not publicly voicing their concerns. They are privately voicing, or they're keeping them private, in part because they don't want the negative exposure. Some of them are genuinely concerned that their licenses are going to be taken. There was just a physician in Oregon whose license was taken, Stephen Latulippe. And so I think that the word that you just used to describe the power grab that's going on right now by Western democratic governments could aptly be described as fascist, because the state is, when I talk about fascism, I'm very interested in these topics because I care a lot about freedom and because obviously we don't want to repeat history. Well, I like to use Benito Mussolini's short version of what fascism is. He said it's the perfect union of the corporation and the state. And the idea is that corporations and the state both work together in order to protect the people, but we all know how that works out. So none of us want that. And it's very dark what's going on right now. To think about it, for a physician to have their license taken, they're having their livelihood taken away from them, their ability to pay their house, mortgage, their ability to send their kids to school, their ability to make their car payments. I can't tell you how many doctors have reached out to me and said, you're brave for doing what you did, but I would never do it because I'm afraid of the state medical board taking my license and robbing me of my ability to make a living. And I've had to, worry about that, but I'm fortunate that I don't have any dependents. It's a little bit less of I could make it if I had to, but it's very concerning, and no one should be fooled by the ruse that this is all about their health, because it can't possibly be about their health because it just isn't supported by the data.
Exactly. Yes, and this is for every country that I have looked into. The data just doesn't support that there's a dangerous pandemic at all.
Well, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about this case you just talked about the doctor who lost his license. Why exactly did he lose it?
So he came out, his name is Stephen Latulippe. People should go watch his video because it's very interesting. It's very interesting to see what he said, and people should listen to what he said and ask themselves, is what this guy said and did worth taking his license over, right? He's a former Air Force, as I understand it, he's a former Air Force physician. So he's a veteran, served his country, went to medical school, then became a family doctor in Oregon. And he got up and said that he and his staff had never worn masks in their clinic in Oregon. I don't know a lot about where he lives, but it doesn't sound like it's a big city. And to give people some context here, you know, COVID hit, and I'm just going to add some disclaimers here. I like believe in COVID. I have friends in New York City, friends in New Jersey. They worked in COVID units. I have friends still working in COVID units right now. I've treated patients with COVID. Just in the last couple of days, I've had more than one patient with COVID contact me for treatment. So it's not like it's foreign to me, and I'm not some conspiracy theorist who thinks it doesn't exist. And most of the things they're calling conspiracy theories about COVID, it's like they're really twisting people's words and not being fair to them at all, in my opinion. But when you look at what happened, you know, the numbers like New York, New Jersey had horrific, you know, fatality rates. Illinois has a high fatality rate. And then two southern states, Illinois and Mississippi, have high mortality rates. And there are a couple of, the time course was basically, it hit New York and New Jersey first, and it was really bad. And a lot of people died. And that did happen, I'm very sure. I'm not going to weigh in on like conspiracy theory videos of empty container trucks and empty, you know, there's a lot, we could go down all those rabbit holes, but at the end of the day, people did die. And the healthcare system was very heavily burdened, taxed. You know, I would not have wanted to be, I actually volunteered to go to New York, but they didn't hire me. So, you know, it is what it is. But I mean, nobody wants a repeat of that. But then in May and June, case numbers started to decline and things started to recover. And then in the middle of the country, which is where I was working in a small rural hospital in the upper Midwest. I won't say where, because I don't really want my employer coming back and talking to me. But I was working in the upper Midwest, which is very, very rural, like a little county of, you know, not more than a few thousand people. And every day we were waiting for this thing to show up. And like part of the hospital labor force got furloughed. A lot of them got laid off. You know, healthcare providers who were supposed to be super busy got laid off in the middle of a pandemic. How does that make any sense? Yeah. And I get that people wanted to contain it and stop the spread. Well, I just started asking basic questions. Like, if you really want to prevent this thing from getting into rural America, why don't you just quarantine the cities? That's where everyone's flying in. That's where everyone's driving out. It would have been not a big deal. You have the state troopers on the highway, PCR testing people and not allowing them to leave the city if, you know, they're positive. And we could talk about all of that, but there's just so many questions that I had over and over and over again. Why aren't they doing it this way? Why are they doing it this way? And then I started to see it impacting my, you know, my friends, the people who I was, you know, the woman I bought my coffee from and my morning, you know, like breakfast bagel or muffin or whatever. And she's telling me about how her income stream is being hurt and how her customers are coming out. And I'm thinking to myself, this thing might kill more small businesses in America than it does people. And, you know, headlines a couple of weeks ago, 48% of American small businesses may shut their doors for good as a result of this. And then you got to go back and look at who it's killing, because the real question is it worth saving the people who are dying from the virus? Is it worth shutting down the entire economy and losing God only knows how many jobs and having those young people suffer in order to save those people who are dying of COVID? And when we look at those who are dying of COVID, it is overwhelmingly the elderly, the infirm, and quite frankly, not a lot of people are willing to say this. The vast majority of people who are going to die young from COVID are going to die young from COVID because they made unhealthy dietary and lifestyle choices. And when you look at the mortality, those states that have the highest mortality rates, they have extremely high proportions of citizens who are on food stamps. It's a government assistance program. And in the United States, the number 1 and 2 purchases with food stamps are junk food and soda. What's the number 1 risk factor for having a bad outcome from COVID? It's being overweight, having metabolic syndrome, eating bad food, being unhealthy. Basically what's happening that no one in the mainstream media wants to talk about is the federal government created a perfect situation for a pandemic to sweep through the country and claim millions of lives, which COVID obviously hasn't claimed millions of lives. But they created the perfect situation for a pandemic to kill a lot of Americans by willfully and purposefully ensuring that cheap, toxic food was the only thing that Americans could afford to eat. And that's been going on for generations now. And nobody wants to talk about it in the Beltway, in politics, because it's really inconvenient.
Thank you for explaining all that.
Yeah.
It's interesting you're saying all this, because in Denmark, the USA is used as an example of how bad things can get. And we keep hearing like, oh, so now 300,000 people have died in the States and 50 people die every hour, I think. And so we keep hearing this in our media, how bad things are in the US.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask you if it's really true. Is it that bad? I mean, is there like a big rise in mortality from other years compared to other years?
Yeah. So one of the things that the media likes to do is they like to zoom in on things in one place and say, look at how bad things are. This is an enormous country. It takes 2 days to drive from one side of it to the other. And having worked in 8 different states, I mean, I have friends who I can call or text right now and say, hey, how are things in Florida? How are things in Minnesota? How are things in Maine? How are things in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York? And they all tell me a different story. And it depends on where you are. Sometimes different neighborhoods are worse than others. So this idea, this fear mongering, I mean, American hospitals, and the other thing is American hospitals have always been full. I mean, I remember in training years ago when, and this is something that people really need to understand, is that demographic shifts determine a lot about healthcare demand. Like if 24% of your population is under the age of 18, you don't have a lot of demand. And let's say like 24% is under the age of 18, 26% is between 18 and 42. And then, you know, between 42 and 60, you've got like 40%. And then you've got a very small proportion over that. I don't know what the exact numbers are in the United States, but the higher the proportion of your population above, you know, in their older years, right, the more demand on the system. And the baby boomers in the United States are a disproportionately high number or proportion of the population. And so as the baby boomers are aging, they're creating a sudden increase in demand on the healthcare infrastructure that we have. So we've had rising rates of hospital census. Every hospital I've been at for more than 1 year, every subsequent year, there's more days where the hospital's full. There's more days where we're struggling to get people out the door so we can accommodate the volumes. I mean, I've literally had days where administrators, and this was way before COVID, where administrators were breathing down my neck saying, get people out of the hospital because we have people in the ER who we need to admit. So on any given day, right, if you told me that we were going to have 20 extra hospitalizations that day in practically any hospital I've ever worked at, I would have said, I don't know where we're going to put those patients. And what happened before COVID is we boarded them in the ER and we waited for beds to free up. And yes, I don't want to minimize how bad it is in some places right now, because I have friends who are telling me that it is bad in certain places. But this idea that the world is ending, the sky is falling, every American hospital is swamped, you know, stay home, you know, be afraid, comply, obey, these bizarre messages from the media are totally unfounded. At the end of the day, I just look at it as they want to sell advertising. They want to sell copy. The legacy media, their business model is, you know, sell advertising and make money that way. And it's obviously not working out for them, which is why, you know, I never get any of my news from them for this exact reason.
Yes. But you don't have any exact numbers about mortality rates compared to other years? Because in Denmark, so far, if you want to hear the numbers, we have had
Sure.
900, not even 1,000 people have died with COVID. It's 961, the latest number of people. Which
Yeah,
is
and that, how many people are there in Denmark?
Exactly, which is 165 out of each million.
Right, exactly, yeah.
That's really a very low number. In the US, it's higher, but it's not very much higher. It's 921 per million.
So we also need to talk about the difference of, you know, between dying with COVID and dying of COVID.
Exactly.
So the analogy that I use with people is if you smoke cigarettes and you walk outside during a thunderstorm to light up and you get struck by lightning and you die, did you die of smoking? I don't really think that's fair, because you could have just gone out to walk your dog. You didn't die of walking your dog. I just saw a news report from Colorado that a county coroner was very upset by the fact that 2 people who died of gunshot wounds had been labeled as COVID deaths, right? And it, like, people are like, oh, well, that's only 2. And I'm like, well, listen, it's a big country. There's a lot of people dying all the time. If you look at the week by week mortality, there's definitely an uptick in April and I think it's March. And we know where that came from. It was New York City and New Jersey. And by the way, the reason the mortality is worse at higher latitudes is that, you know, people have been told that the sun is bad for them, which is nonsense. The sun is a really important, you know, component of health. The sun basically drove COVID out of, you know, practically speaking, it drove its levels way, way down. That's why we're seeing a second wave in the fall. But anyway, point being, the numbers are not that different from last year. 10, 15% difference. Now, as I was saying before, like, I'm really concerned about the fact that American hospitals are so full and so busy. When I was going through training and I was talking to administrators about this, I would say, hey, what happens if we have a mass casualty event? What happens if a plane crashes or a train derails or there's a 50-car pileup? And nobody really had any answers. And I would always draw the analogy and just say, well, hang on a minute. You know, the local hotel is full like 2 days a year, because there's 2 days a year when there might be like a huge convention plus tourist season, and then the hotel is full. But every other day of the year, probably 90% of the hotel is empty. Why aren't hospitals that way? And the reality is that American medicine has become more and more and more a fascist enterprise, in my opinion, because you see this incestuous relationship between the administrators who are running the hospitals and the politicians who they then, you know, lobby to get special favors. And this whole thing in our country about like socialized medicine versus, you know, free market medicine is really, it's this bait and switch where the free market system worked great. And then people started to make laws and rules and regulations and prevent doctors from doing what they thought was right. And they also started to, you know, the pharmaceutical industry started to lobby Congress and make basically practicing medicine harder and harder and harder. And that's why now in America, we really don't have very many private practices. We just have big hospitals, and the big hospitals gobbled up all the smaller hospitals. And, you know, now they're being overrun because they're being run by administrators who are really, and, you know, we have nonprofits in this, and they're almost all nonprofits, but I like to joke that the hospitals are very profitable nonprofits. And I know that because the CEO drives a luxury sedan. And at the end of the day, I really don't trust these people who are saying, you know, the problem is people coming out of their homes. My question is, why didn't you build hospitals that had extra capacity? Why didn't you train enough nurses? Why didn't you train enough doctors? Why isn't there more preventative care? Why do all of my patients come to me and say, I can't find a doctor like you who will listen to me and talk to me and spend time helping me stay healthy rather than trying to just fix everything with a pill? So it's all part of the narrative to destroy, you know, liberty and freedom and our ability to act on our own and stay healthy rather than obviously, you know, wind up sick in the hospital.
Exactly. I can name you some facts from Denmark. For example, our government and our media is telling us our hospitals are overburdened and we have to lock down, we have to be restricted. Freedom. But actually, the fact is that 3 years ago, in the winter of 2017-2018, we had an influenza epidemic that was much worse, and like more than double as many people died, and the hospitals were actually overburdened. But nobody talks about that, and nobody did anything about that. There was no lockdown, there was no ruining our economy at that time, and nobody even remembers.
Right. There's no context. But, you know, and really every hospital I've ever worked at, there have been days where we had to ship people, you know, to other hospitals because we were full. And, you know, people won't talk about it and they won't tell the patients, but there's times where, you know, hey, you know, we could have shipped this person to this hospital and had a procedure done, but it was full. So we just kept them here and we just went without it. You know,
so basically what you're saying is hospitals being overburdened is a normal phenomenon, and it's not specific to COVID-19.
Yes. And we see that with normal variations in hospital volumes. And, you know, the COVID pandemic has hit certain places worse than others. I don't like to call it a pandemic because I really think that's unfair, but the COVID situation has hit and taxed more certain healthcare systems worse than others. But all those healthcare systems were set up to fail by decades of mismanagement by the very people who are asking us to give them more power to fix the problem. And the analogy that I give people is, look, I want you to imagine you're paying someone to maintain your yard. and you go on vacation for a few months, you're not paying close attention, you come back and everything is overgrown and the grass is like as high as your knees, and you call this person, you say, hey, I need you to mow the lawn. What happened? And they say, yeah, you know, I need you to pay me more money and buy me some extra equipment so I can take care of it. You don't give that person a raise, and you don't give that person up, you know, you don't tell that person, oh yeah, I think I'll have you clean my house as well. You fire them and you find somebody new. And I mean, the longer I practice medicine in this country, and I hear similar things from, you know, from other countries, the people who are running American medicine are incompetent. And a lot of them are just totally in bed with the pharmaceutical industry. And they're really just in it for the money. And those of them who are not are these brainwashed, obedient idiots who don't understand sometimes just basic math. And somehow they want us to give them more power, which is insane.
Dr. Stillman, why do you say that it's unfair to call it a pandemic?
Well, first of all, you know, I don't know the dictionary definition of a pandemic. And I'm sure that the epidemiologists have some kind of very specific, you know, definition of it. If they want to define it that way, that's fine. But from what I've seen, and comparing it to, for example, to the 1918 influenza, if the 1918 influenza pandemic is the bar for a pandemic, this one doesn't cross the bar. And if you want to call it a pandemic, okay. But, you know, there are still counties and in this country where very, very, very few people have died of this. And if you come back to me and say, well, you know, look at all the numbers, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, look, I know these patients. I've been taking care of them for years now. A lot of them were going to die from their heart disease, from their lung disease, from their cancer. You want to tell me they died of COVID? They died with COVID. Don't conflate the two.
It is the same in Denmark. It's official guidelines. Anybody who dies in the first month after a positive PCR test are registered as deaths with COVID-19.
Yeah.
No matter what they died of.
And if you look at the influenza numbers in the United States for the last 12 months, influenza usually kills between, well, let's talk about the last 5 years. Influenza has killed between 11,000, I think, and about 60,000, round numbers. Well, okay, how many did it kill in the last 12 months? 6,000. 6,000. So influenza mortality is down by 50 to 90%, depending on the year you're comparing it to. That's great news you're never going to hear from the fear-mongering mainstream media because it doesn't sell advertising. But influenza is down. Those people, you know, got tested for COVID instead. And they didn't get tested for flu because we were looking for COVID. And, you know, the flu, people say it kills a lot of people. Well, again, a lot of these people were going to die from their chronic diseases anyway. And when you're looking at a patient whose lungs are filling up with fluid, who's got really severe heart disease, they might test positive for influenza. But the question is, well, hang on, is this person just having worsening heart failure, or do they have influenza? There's this chicken or the egg, you know, question that we can't really, to my intellectual curiosity, satisfy, and that I think is academic. You know, you have to ask yourself, if 10,000 small business owners in America in the next year kill themselves because their businesses went under and it was their heart and soul and their whole life's work to have that business, or if 10,000 marriages get dissolved because the couple couldn't get along at home, or because one of them lost their income and it led to marital strife, right? Whatever those numbers end up being, and they're never going to be attributed to the pandemic, how many of those are worth it to save this many lives of people in nursing homes who are at the end of their lives? And, you know, those people who are in nursing homes, I know them. They would never want their children to be impoverished so that they could have an extra 6 months, a year, 2 years on this earth. They're very loving, giving, self-sacrificing people. And they're not interested. I mean, it's not like they're not afraid to die. They have just as much anxiety about that as most people. But there's no question in my mind that a lot of them are concerned with the erosion of our rights, our freedoms, and they wouldn't want the younger generation to have permanent damage to their relationships, you know, significant increases in, say, suicide. I mean, and I don't see the mainstream authorities paying much attention to how this is actually impacting, for example, you know, suicide rates, many of which, by the way, will not rise for a matter of months to years after the pandemic, because that's when the economic fallout's actually going to happen.
Yes, one of the things that I really wonder about is why has nobody asked these old and weak people if they want to be isolated, because they are being forced to be alone in care homes. And there are many, many cases in Europe, in Denmark, where old people are dying alone and they are not allowed to have their families over for Christmas. And I don't think if these people were given a choice that they would actually, I think they would prefer to die with COVID-19 than die alone without their families.
My dad's 81. He's in good health. I told him to quarantine at the beginning of this because I had no idea what we were facing. And in the middle of the summer, I just said, Dad, you got to live your life. And he said, yeah, I know. I got to live my life. I want to go out and I want to do things. You know, this is a free country. We're supposed to be able to take the risks we want to take. And if, you know, elderly people want to self quarantine and be totally isolated from society, they can do that. I don't think that, I mean, I don't see the demand for that from them.
Exactly. And also, I have wondered for a long time now, why don't we just isolate those people who are actually at risk from this disease and let the other people live their lives?
Right. Right.
Because the numbers are clear, and especially in Denmark, the average age of the people who die with COVID-19 is 82 in Denmark.
That's high.
That's
You know, I
really
mean,
higher than average age for the population.
Right. What's your life expectancy over there?
It's 81.
Ours is 76.
Yeah.
And I don't know what our average age of COVID deaths is, but it's up there. 40% of the deaths are nursing home residents.
And also, I have looked at the numbers. More than 80% of those people who have died with COVID-19 and are on average 82 years old, they actually have active cancer or lung diseases to begin with. They are already sick to start.
Right, exactly.
So why is our economy being destroyed? That's my question. Because in Denmark, we have just been locked down again. Even though there is no emergency whatsoever, the government has been pushing people to get tested with this PCR test, which I want to ask you about in a minute. And so they have been forcing people to get tested more and more. And so they find more cases. And then they keep blowing this up in the media like, oh, there's more people, more cases.
Right.
We have to lock down again. But in reality, there's really no emergency. They're just testing more people.
Yeah, right. That's a really important question to ask. Are we just getting more positives because we're testing more people? I am testing this hypothesis right now, and I won't say how. But from the people who I know who've bothered to look into the PCR test and whether or not it's reliable, they have concerns that it is overly sensitive. And when I first started seeing cases, I was seeing them in people who had multiple other medical problems. And they weren't presenting the way that I expected them to based on the literature that I had read and what I had heard from colleagues in New York. And so I began to wonder, are these people do they just have it, or are they actually sick from it? And then one of them I remember was a false positive. Of the first 3 cases that I saw, one was a false positive. And I just scratched my head and I thought you told me this was a low false positive rate. And the problem with PCR testing, so that people understand what it is that you take genetic primers and you put them into whatever sample you're testing, and then you run them in a machine to amplify the amount of DNA that you have there. And then you quantify how much of the DNA ended up getting expressed. And this is a very inelegant solution to figuring out if someone's got a virus. And viruses have a very small genome. And they also have a lot of common sequences, right? This is a novel coronavirus, right? So it's related to all the other coronaviruses. So, and these PCR testing is not, it's not 100% accurate, and it depends on how many cycles you do and what the cycles are set at and all the other settings.
Do you know how many cycles are being used in the United States?
I don't know, but here's the other thing. It's a big country. So how do I know if one county's cycling number is the same as another county's? Like if LabCorp tells me that all their numbers are the same across the country, well, LabCorp operates in all 50 states. So I know that's a lot of tests. But there's regional healthcare systems, there's independent doctors' offices. I mean, every lab company in America right now is trying to sell this doctor a COVID test. It's exhausting, actually, the number of sales calls I've gotten from it. Point being, if you go back and you actually listen to Kary Mullis, who is the chemist who came up with the PCR test, I think he won the Nobel Prize for it. No big deal, right? He said, this is not a great test for documenting and proving active infection. He said, if you amplify it enough, you'll find anything you want. That's concerning. And people have every right to be skeptical of people telling them that a test that a lot of them are making a lot of money on should be done. I mean, people are making fortunes off of COVID testing right now, right? Who's talking? People. I mean, lab companies, right? I mean, if you made 50 cents on every COVID test, and that's not a lot of money, the margins might be way better than that, especially for the people who are early to market. I mean, people just need to think about how much money is at stake here, right? Like, you really want to tell me there's not any opportunity for malfeasance, for people to exaggerate the risks, exaggerate how bad things are? I mean, come on. Like, have people lost their minds? Like, there's a lot of money on the line, a lot. There's 325 something million Americans. If every one of them gets a $10 vaccine, that's a, $3.25 billion payday.
Exactly.
If they all get a $10 PCR test, that's another $3.2 billion payday, right?
It only costs $10.
Let's just say it did, right?
In Denmark, it costs a lot more than $10.
Exactly, right? If it's $50 or $100, we're really talking about a lot of money.
Yeah, the numbers I saw were much higher than 100 per test in Denmark. They're really, and we are like very communist to start with. So of course the state is paying everything, but it's like we are building up a huge debt here for testing, for a very unreliable test. And we are running it in, I think 34 or 35 cycles, which I have read is really unreliable. It's just way too many cycles. So we don't know if how many people actually are these cases. And most of these cases don't have any symptoms. They're not sick at all.
Right. Right.
They're just tested positive, which means they have to self-isolate. And there's just no reason, because as far as I understood, asymptomatic patients don't actually, are not contagious. They don't carry it. I don't know the word in English, so.
It's very hard to document. It's very hard to document and actually study contagiousness. And, most people don't stop to think, but like, where does the seasonal influenza come from? Does it come down to us from like outer space? Does it show up? Does it come out of the ground when it gets cold? No, it doesn't do any of these things. All these viral, DNA that code the proteins that make the viral capsid and envelope and all this, all of them are part of us, right? So, they activate under certain environmental circumstances, and they activate when the body is under stress. And so this whole idea that, because like, let's say that somebody is well and they're exposed to somebody with a viral illness, and they go home and they think nothing of it, and 3 days later they come down with sick, and they say, oh, well, I got exposed to, my neighbor, they must have given me the virus. Well, what if the virus was already in them and it just reactivated? And you hear, you see these stories of people saying, I don't know how I could possibly have gotten the virus. I was, shut in my apartment. I didn't even get delivery. I was living off of freezer meals. How did I get it? Did it go through the plumbing? Did it magically get through the walls? So people need to stop and really think. And here's what really bothers me. It wouldn't bother me, all this, as much as it does if my elected representatives had convened and said, we think we should do this. Because then I can go to them, because I can't pick up the phone and have any reasonable expectation for my governor to listen to me, because he's got 8 million other Virginians to listen to. It's a lot of people. But my state representatives, my local representatives, senators, when I call them, I often get a call back, especially if I ask for it. And we have legislatures, we have, congressional bodies, so that they can look at the evidence, ask their constituencies what they want, and then they can debate with other legislators what they should do, and then they can pass legislation. That's how democracies are supposed to function. At least in the United States, I don't know what it's like over there, we are having governors run the show. They just say, close down, don't close down. You know, we're not going to enforce a mask mandate. We are going to enforce a mask mandate. There are mayors who are doing different things. There's no convening of the legislature to actually look at the data and ask what is the proper course of action. And as we've alluded to, really, there's not a very broad scope of acceptable opinion being presented on the mainstream media. I don't see people who have an alternative opinion like me on mainstream media networks laying out the data. And when they've gone viral, their videos have been shut down, delisted. Many of them have lost their jobs, like Steve Latulippe in Oregon, he lost his license. So we're in a situation where the state is saying there's not an acceptable, there's a certain group of opinions that are inhumane and wrong and evil, and we're going to shut those down. And that should make everybody really concerned.
Yeah, censorship is growing very fast as well. I mean, we are many people in Denmark who are fighting against this. We call ourselves freedom fighters, and we share a lot of information, and we are being censored all the time on social media.
Same thing's happening here. And what amazes me about it is the people who I see who are looking into it and who are most active. A lot of them are former military, and they're not they're being labeled as right-wing extremists. They're absolutely not right-wing extremists. They're, what when I was growing up was sort of the norm. They like to go out and hunt and fish and be outside. They don't like other people telling them what to do. They run their own businesses. They pay their taxes. They're very engaged in their communities. They're loving husbands, fathers, family men, and they're being labeled as right-wing conspiracy theory touting nut jobs who need to be put in re-education camps.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah, the same is happening here. We are being labeled conspiracy theorists or right-wing extremists, and I have always been very left-wing, so it's very funny. Or we are being also, one of the things we are being called is like Trump fans, like we are somehow brainwashed by Donald Trump, which like we have nothing to do with Trump whatsoever. I don't even understand that. Also, sometimes, all kinds of weird accusations, but actually what we are doing is looking at the numbers and at the facts, which the media is not doing. They're misrepresenting, manipulating, and maybe even lying.
Right.
And as is our government. They are lying about how dangerous this disease is.
Yeah, and it would be one thing if, for example, like let's say I lived in New York City and I said, hey, I don't think we should lock down, but 90% of my neighbors said, we really want to lock down. I'd say, well, hey, all right. I mean, you guys are really that worried. I'm not going to get in your way. If you're going to actually empower your government to do this, I would support and encourage people to sue for their First Amendment rights to gather, assembly, petition the government for redress of grievances, all those things, right? But at the end of the day, what's happening in the United States that people overseas should know about is that people are voting with their feet. Migrations are taking place and people are fleeing these failed totalitarian states like California and New York, and they're going to places like Florida, they're going to places like Texas, they're going to places like Idaho, Montana, Tennessee, where there's a very much still a culture of we're going to do what we want and you're not going to trample the Constitution.
I can hear, Denmark is very different from the United States because we are one small country. So the same thing is happening everywhere. And we just had a few days ago a national lockdown again. And they just closed down it with 1 day notice. They closed down all the shops before Christmas shopping could start. So of course, all the owners of the shops, they are saying we are going to go bankrupt. And it seems to me that our government is destroying all private businesses on purpose. I cannot really see any other explanation than that they are actually ruining private businesses.
Yeah, I mean, should we talk about the Great Reset?
Well, if you want to.
Because I mean, they're very clear with what they want. They want us to own nothing. This is not conspiracy theorists. I mean, Klaus Schwab published this. This is like, he's said this many, many times. They want us to own nothing. Well, if you own nothing, what do you control about your own life? You have what the government gives you or allows you to rent from them. You're not really free anymore.
I'm very happy you bring this up because it's quite taboo amongst most people still that there is a plan, because most people cannot get over the fact that why would our government do that? They cannot understand it. They're like, why would they do that? What interest do they have? But there is a plan. There's an official plan.
Yeah.
And it's called the Great Reset, and it's right out there.
Yeah. And the answer to why they would do that is very, very simple. It's actually really hard to be smart and good and to get ahead in a capitalist society. It's very hard. You talk to any entrepreneur, they'll tell you, I had to work so hard for so many years. I had to sacrifice nights, weekends, Christmases. When my friends were out having fun, I was working. And then they have $1 million in their bank account and they're opening new stores and franchising and whatever, and life is really good. They're still working really hard, but people say, wow, like, you know, you're so successful, or, you know, you owe us that because you have more than you deserve. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. The person sacrificed a lot. And it's one of the most amazing things to me is how when like people grow up with this entitlement and they've been given everything, they're grossly incompetent and they have no idea what to do and how to do it. So, you know, people who want to create security for themselves and their families, if they don't allow other people to compete with them, which is what capitalism is really all about, then they never have any competition, and then nobody can unseat them. And I would challenge you to go back and look at the wealthiest families in Denmark. Have they changed in the last 100 years? Are the same names at the top of the list? Because in the United States, like, you know, we have people like Elon Musk show up from, I think he's from South Africa, but maybe I'm totally wrong with that. We have guys like Elon Musk show up and all of a sudden they're joining the S&P 500, you know, on Monday morning in December of 2020, having come up from nothing. And that happens, I mean, a lot here. And so if you control what other people, if you control what the people own, then you can have as much stuff as you want because you can just take it. You can just appoint yourself you can appoint yourself to enormous amounts of power that enable you to have, you know, the luxuries that you desire.
The way I'm perceiving what's happening, and I'm only talking about Denmark right now, it's like an ultra-communist takeover, where already now the state is saying, we will buy those businesses that go bankrupt. We will buy them and own shares in them. So basically,
yeah, exactly.
They're ruining businesses and then they're overtaking them. Also, they have ruined a whole business of, what do you call it, fur production, like animals for fur. They're called minks.
Yeah, I heard about this. Yeah, they killed all of them because they got infected with COVID, supposedly.
It's a really bad story. Like this, they said, okay, there's a mutation of the COVID-19 virus. It's in these ferrets. Are they called ferrets or minks in English? Whatever, animals. And so they decided suddenly to kill all these animals. They sent the army there to these farmers, and they forced the farmers to kill all their animals. While this was going on, and they said to the farmers, you have 1 week to finish this and then you will get a bonus for being quick. But while this was happening, and these farmers were crying on national TV, like this, their life's work in multiple generations, right?
Yeah.
While this all was happening, we found out that it was totally illegal what was happening. They had no law supporting this order. So it was an illegal order with the military enforcing it. And there was a huge uproar and a huge revolt in the streets against this. But they are still in the government. They are still going on lies, on undemocratic practices. It's a scandal what's happening in Denmark.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
They are lying, they are breaking the constitution, they are manipulating numbers, they are forcing us to give up all our liberties, our freedom, our economy, everything. And we have 961 deaths with COVID.
Yeah, that blows my mind. 961?
961.
How many people die in Denmark every year?
I don't know right now, but we have no excess mortality. The mortality rate is totally as it's always been.
Yeah, Australia has similar numbers to you. I think it's like 1,000 Australians have died and they've locked the whole country down. It's amazing to me.
You do know actually which country has been hit the worst if you look at percentage of people dying?
Probably the one that's done the most testing.
No, I mean like deaths out of the population. Like if you look at how many out of a million.
Probably the one that's done the most testing.
All right, okay.
I mean, I'm serious. Like, cause you know, if even with a low false positive test rate, if you test everyone who's going to die that year, which, you know, I don't know how many people will test for COVID who are going to die this year, but basically what's happening is if you look at the average hospital, right? The top killers in the United States are heart disease, cancer, stroke, and a lot of those people have lung diseases. So they come in and they're short of breath, or their oxygen levels are low anyway. We test anyone who has a whiff of what could be COVID-19. So we might test 90% of the people in the United States who are going to die this year for COVID-19 within a month of their death. Because the usual pattern is, grandpa shows up at the hospital once a year with pneumonia and he goes home to the nursing home. And then grandpa shows up every 6 months, and then every 3 months, and then every 6 weeks, and then every 2 weeks. And then grandpa is in the hospital and out of the hospital, and he's never really home anymore. Well, if that's the pattern, there's a really high likelihood of testing him for COVID in the month before his death and having him be attributed to that, whether he's dying of stage 4 pancreatic cancer or brain cancer or, heart failure.
So we can easily agree that the actual numbers of deaths by COVID-19 must be lower than the official ones.
As far as people who would have survived if they had never contracted it, I agree with you.
Yes.
If COVID had not been, and I don't know what you want to call it, released from a Chinese bioweapons lab or mutated in a bat market or whatever, right? If that just hadn't happened, how many people would be alive today? I don't know. But that's the real question that people should be asking and that the media should be asking. How many people actually have, how many lives and how many years of life and years of, really meaningful life have been lost to this? Because it's one thing if a 30-year-old dies in a tragic accident who had a wife and kids and, a loving family, compared to a 90-year-old whose family are all deceased and who lives in the nursing home and doesn't remember what day of the week it is and thinks that Ronald Reagan is still the president. Those are two very different deaths.
Yes, I agree.
So.
I just want to answer my own question from before, because the country that's hit the worst percent-wise is actually Belgium, which is my country of origin.
Yeah.
By far, actually. In Belgium, 18,000 people have died, which means it's 1,583 per million. And also in Belgium, they are on average 80 years. And
yep. Right. So
and that makes, if you look at the whole population, how many people in Belgium have died with COVID-19 since the start of the pandemic, it's 0.158.
I know. Yeah. It's amazing.
And that's the worst country in the world, percent-wise.
Yeah. You sort of look at these numbers and you think, am I crazy or are they crazy? Can they really be this crazy? Apparently so.
Are really low, and I am really, really not scared of this disease, but I am very scared of the political, how this is going politically.
Right.
I am very worried because anytime now they could just close the borders, and in theory they could just force vaccinate everybody because the laws are all there.
That's right. And if you don't comply, they can say, well, we're going to cut off your food. We're going to cut off your water to your apartment. It puts them in a position to completely and totally control political dissent in their countries. And so if people have other concerns totally unrelated to COVID, they can just be crushed.
There was a protest against forced vaccination, so they sort of wrote that out of the coming epidemic law, which is still on the way. Yeah. But they can still do it if they really want to. And what they are proposing now is that people who will not take the vaccine will not be able to take a bus, go to the library, go to school, take a job, leave the country, go to festivals, nothing.
Yeah, they'll be totally ostracized from society. Yeah.
They want to install a sort of apartheid regime where people between the vaccinated and the non-vaccinated.
Yeah.
And honestly, like, if I have looked into these vaccines, and I would never, ever, ever take it. Even if I got all Bill Gates's money, I wouldn't take it. I just wouldn't take it. Can you tell what do you know about the vaccine? Because it's a totally new type of vaccine, right?
I have honestly done no research on the vaccine, but one thing really stands out to me, which is they've been trying to make coronavirus vaccines for years and they've been failing. So why would they suddenly succeed in 9 months?
what I heard from other doctors who have spoken out is that they have gotten an exemption from the normal rules because yes, the vaccines they have been trying before.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I mean they broke the rules for them.
Yes, they made a special law exempting the testing, so they don't test on animals anymore. So now they just test it on the humans.
And as you may know, the laws in the United States exempt vaccine manufacturers from liabilities associated with their product. So anyone who gets hurt by the vaccine, if they're going to be compensated at all, they're compensated through the federal government, which is, I mean, it's like saying that, if my brakes on my car go out tomorrow and I am horribly burned over like 85% of my body, the government's going to pay for my medical bills and not the car company. Or it's like saying that if I had a rifle and it misfired because of a factory or manufacturer's defect and it killed somebody, the government would pay their, pay the cost, not the gun manufacturer. Or it's like having a builder, build your house and make a bunch of mistakes and then not be liable for the damage due to whatever kind of mistake they made and have the government bail you out. I mean, that's fascism right there. And it's really sick. But this is all the time I've got today.
Yeah.
And I haven't really done any more research on the vaccine than that.
No, it's a very interesting topic.
Yeah. Thanks for reaching out. And if you guys want more information, I'm here and I'm just trying to communicate with people all over the world to help them understand what's going on and give them some context from somebody who actually works in American hospitals and not just in hot zones, but in very rural areas, what's really going on. So
thank you very much, Dr. Stillman.
Thanks for having me.